The laughter hit him before he even cleared the doorway. "Someone get this guy a map to the VFW hall." The voice boomed across the ceremonial space, and a crowd of decorated operators erupted in appreciative chuckles. Vice Admiral Marcus Whitmore stood at the center of the gathering like a man born to command attention, his chest heavy with ribbons, his dress whites immaculate, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. He gestured toward the entrance where an old man had just shuffled through the double doors. "Look at this, gentlemen. I think we have a lost tourist." The old man paused just inside the threshold. He wore faded khaki trousers and a plain navy windbreaker that had seen better decades. No medals adorned his chest. No insignia marked his collar. His white hair was cropped short in a style that might have been military once, but now just looked like the practical choice of a man who no longer cared about appearances. He was thin, slightly stooped, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had logged too many hard miles. But if anyone had been watching closely, and almost no one was, they might have noticed something peculiar about the way his eyes moved. They swept the room in a precise pattern. Doorways first, then windows, then the positions of every person between him and the exits. It took less than 2 seconds, and it was so subtle that it appeared to be nothing more than an old man getting his bearings. Vice Admiral Whitmore continued his performance for the young SEALs clustered around him. These men were the elite of the elite, fresh from deployments that would never make the news, their bodies honed into weapons, their confidence radiating like heat. They looked at the old man and saw exactly what their admiral wanted them to see. A nobody, a relic, perhaps a veteran of some forgotten peacetime service, wandering into the wrong building. "Nice facility you have here, sir," the old man said. His voice was quiet, almost soft, carrying just enough to reach the admiral without straining. There was no defensiveness in it, no embarrassment, just a simple observation delivered with what might have been respect or might have been something else entirely. Whitmore's grin widened. He was in his element now, the center of attention, the apex predator in a room full of predators. At 54, he had built a reputation as one of the most decorated SEAL officers of his generation. He had commanded missions that shaped foreign policy. He had buried friends and enemies alike. And he had developed an absolute intolerance for what he perceived as weakness or pretension. "Facility," he repeated, drawing out the word for comic effect. "This facility, old-timer, is Naval Special Warfare Command. This is where warriors train, where legends are made." He paused, letting his gaze travel meaningfully over the old man's unremarkable clothing. "I'm guessing you took a wrong turn somewhere around 1975. More laughter from the crowd. A few of the younger operators exchanged glances that carried the particular cruelty of men who had never known vulnerability. The old man simply nodded, as if the admiral had said something perfectly reasonable. He took a few more steps into the room, and again, if anyone had been paying the right kind of attention, they might have noticed that his footfalls made almost no sound on the polished floor. His weight distribution was perfect. His movements were economical in a way that spoke of training so deeply ingrained it had become unconscious. Near the back of the ceremonial hall, a retired senior chief named Dwight Okonkwo had been sharing sea stories with 2 other oldtimers when the commotion at the entrance caught his attention. He turned casually, expecting to see nothing of consequence, and then his face went the color of old bone. His hand found the arm of the man beside him and gripped hard enough to leave marks. "Oh, dear God," he whispered. "That is not possible." His companion frowned and asked what was wrong, but Okonkwo was already trying to push through the crowd, his urgency at odds with the festive atmosphere. No one paid him any attention. All eyes remained fixed on the Admiral's show. Whitmore was warming to his subject now. He began explaining to his young operators that respect in the SEAL community was earned through blood and sacrifice, through missions accomplished and brothers carried home. He gestured again toward the old man, who had stopped walking and now stood alone in a small clearing the crowd had unconsciously created around him. "This," Whitmore announced, "is what happens when you let just anyone wander into a heritage event. Notre event. No de querasgens." Probably spent his service time filing paperwork at some supply depot. He shook his head with theatrical disappointment. No offense, old-timer, but this gathering is for actual operators. The old man's expression did not change. His hands remained loose at his sides, fingers slightly curved, relaxed in a way that men who have never known violence could never quite replicate. He looked at the Admiral with eyes that held neither anger nor submission, only a quiet steadiness that seemed somehow out of place. I was invited, he said simply, by Commodore Hartwick, for the heritage ceremony. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Commodore Hartwick was the installation commander, a man whose word carried considerable weight. But Whitmore only scoffed. Anyone can claim an invitation, he said. I have been running these events for 6 years, and I have never seen your face. He stepped closer, using his height advantage to loom over the smaller, older man. So why do you not tell us who you really are and what you actually did during your supposed service? Wherever you're watching this story unfold, we would love to know. Drop a comment and tell us where you are joining from today. Because stories like this one, stories of quiet heroes whose true nature remains hidden beneath humble appearances, they happen everywhere. In every town, in every community, there are people walking among us whose past would astonish us if we only knew. Maybe you have met someone like that yourself. The old man looked up at the Admiral, and for just a moment, something flickered in those pale blue eyes. It was there and gone so quickly that Whitmore missed it entirely, but 2 of the older veterans in the crowd felt the hair rise on the backs of their necks without understanding why. I was a special warfare operator, the old man said. Nothing special. Whitmore laughed, a harsh bark of disbelief. He turned to his audience with his arms spread wide, inviting them to share in the absurdity. Nothing special, he repeated. Well, that much is obvious. No trident pin. No declarations. No proof of anything at all. He leaned in close enough that the old man could smell the coffee on his breath. Let me guess. You rang the bell during Hell Week. Quit when it got too hard. And now you show up at these events pretending you were one of us. The accusation hung in the air like poison. To ring the bell was to quit SEAL training voluntarily, to admit defeat, to be forever marked as someone who could not meet the standard. It was the deepest insult one could offer to anyone who had ever worn the trident. The old man did not flinch. His breathing remained steady. His hand stayed loose. But somewhere in the depths of his memory, a door creaked open, and through it came the screaming of helicopter rotors and the smell of cordite and jungle rot and blood. His fingers moved unconsciously to his left wrist, touching bare skin where a watch had once rested. A watch given to him by 7 men who boarded a helicopter in a country that would deny their presence, on a mission that would never exist in any official record. 7 men who trusted him to bring them home. He had buried that watch with the last of them 40 years ago in a ceremony attended by no one. What happened next would change everything Admiral Marcus Whitmore thought he knew about heroes, about service, and about the danger of judging a book by its cover. Because in exactly 20 minutes, his entire world was going to collapse around him. And the quiet old man, standing before him, would be the one left standing in the wreckage. The Admiral was not finished. Men like Marcus Whitmore never were. Not when they sensed weakness. Not when they had an audience hungry for blood. He circled the old man slowly, deliberately, the way a shark circles wounded prey. His young SEALs watched with the eager attention of students observing a masterclass in dominance. So let me understand this correctly, Whitmore said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ceremonial hall. You claim to be a special warfare operator. You claim to have been invited by Commodore Hartwick himself. And yet you show up to a heritage event honoring the finest warriors this nation has ever produced dressed like you are about to mow your lawn. He paused to let the laughter wash over him, feeding on it like fuel. The old man called Harlan Creedy stood motionless in the center of that laughter. His weathered face betrayed nothing. Not embarrassment, not anger, not even the mild irritation that most men would feel at being made a public spectacle. He simply waited, his breathing slow and even, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet in a stance so natural it appeared to be nothing at all. Tell me something, Whitmore continued, emboldened by the lack of resistance. What was your rate? What was your specialty? Because I have been in this community for 30 years, and I can spot a real operator from across a room. He jabbed a finger toward Harlan's chest without quite touching him. You do not have it. Whatever it is that makes us who we are, you do not have it. Harlan's pale blue eyes met the Admiral's gaze without wavering. I was just a shooter, he said quietly. Spent most of my time in places that do not exist anymore. Did work that never made it into any report worth reading. The response was so understated, so devoid of bravado, that it seemed to confirm every suspicion Whitmore had already formed. A real operator would have fired back. A real warrior would have defended his honor. This old man just stood there absorbing abuse like a sponge absorbing water. Places that do not exist, Whitmore repeated with theatrical incredulity. Work that never made the reports. He turned to his audience with a knowing smile. Gentlemen, I believe we have found ourselves a genuine Walter Mitty. A fantasist. The kind of man who watches war movies and convinces himself he was there. Several of the younger operators snickered. One of them, a lieutenant with a combat deployment patch on his shoulder, called out that maybe the old-timer got his memories mixed up with a video game. But not everyone was laughing. Near the back of the room, Dwight Okonkwo had finally pushed through the crowd. His face was slick with sweat despite the air conditioning, and his hands trembled slightly as he tried to catch the attention of anyone who might listen. He grabbed the arm of a retired captain he recognized and spoke urgently into his ear. The captain's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion to something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to stare at the old man in the center of the room, then back at Okonkwo, then back at the old man again. Are you certain? He asked, his voice barely audible. Okonkwo nodded. I served under him in 1987. 3 months in a place I still cannot name. I would know that face anywhere, even after all these years. That is him. God help us all. That is Echo 9. The captain went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly unable to form words adequate to the situation. Meanwhile, Admiral Whitmore had moved on to direct interrogation. He stood inches from Harlan now, using every tool of physical intimidation he had mastered over 3 decades of leadership. The height difference between them was pronounced, and Whitmore exploited it ruthlessly. Let's try something simple, he said. Basic SEAL history. Anyone who actually went through the pipeline would know this cold. He folded his arms across his decorated chest. When was the first SEAL team commissioned? January 1962. Harlan replied without hesitation. President Kennedy authorized the formation of SEAL Teams 1 and 2. Team 1 at Coronado. Team 2 at Little Creek. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. Lucky guess. A Google search could tell you that. He tried again. What is the origin of the term frogman? Harlan's response came with the same quiet precision. World War II. The Naval Combat Demolition Units and Underwater Demolition Teams. They cleared beach obstacles for amphibious landings. Normandy. Pacific Theater. The name came from the diving equipment and the amount of time spent in the water. The Admiral's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The old man was not supposed to know these things. Not with this level of detail. Not delivered with his casual confidence. Fine, Whitmore said, switching tactics. Book knowledge is easy. Let's talk about something real. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a more intimate register designed to unsettle. Combat de promo. How many confirmed kills do you have? What operations did you run? Give me something I can verify. The question hung in the air between them. Around the room, conversations had died away as more people tuned into the confrontation. There was blood in the water now, and everyone could sense it. Harlan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. Most of what I did remains classified, he said. The operations I ran do not exist in any database you have access to. The men I worked with are either dead or they have spent their lives pretending those missions never happened. He paused, and something shifted in his eyes, a shadow passing across still water. I am not in the business of discussing body counts at cocktail parties, Admiral. It was the first time Harlan had used Whitmore's rank, and somehow the way he said it made the title sound smaller than it should have. Whitmore felt his face flush with anger. Convenient, he snapped. Very convenient. Every faker who walks through these doors has the same excuse. Everything is classified. Nothing can be verified. He spread his arms wide and addressed the room. Do you see what I mean, gentlemen? This is exactly the kind of stolen valor nonsense that disrespects everything we have sacrificed. A murmur of agreement rippled through the younger operators. But the older veterans in the room had grown very quiet. Several of them were watching Harlan with expressions that had shifted from amusement to something far more complicated. Lieutenant Commander Vincent Reed stood near the side wall, his arms crossed, his brow furrowed. He was 36 years old and had spent the last 12 years in naval special warfare. He had seen combat on 4 continents. He had lost friends in firefights that would haunt him forever. And something about this old man was setting off every alarm in his nervous system. It was the stillness. Reed had trained with some of the most dangerous men on Earth, instructors whose resumes read like action movie scripts. Those men shared a quality that was difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss once you knew what to look for. They possessed a stillness that went beyond mere calm. It was the stillness of a coiled spring, the stillness of a predator waiting in tall grass. This old man had it, despite the shabby clothes, despite the apparent frailty, despite everything Whitmore was saying. The old man had it in spades. Reed quietly excused himself and slipped out a side door. He needed to make a phone call. Back in the ceremonial hall, Admiral Whitmore was preparing his final assault. He reached out and placed a hand on Harlan's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to appear fatherly, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of condescension. Look, he said, softening his voice just enough to sound reasonable. I am sure you served in some capacity. Maybe you were a cook. Maybe you were a mechanic. There is no shame in support roles. But this event is for operators, for the men who actually pulled triggers and kicked down doors. He squeezed Harlan's shoulder slightly. So why do you not head on home, and we will pretend this little misunderstanding never happened? Harlan looked at the hand on his shoulder for a moment. Then he looked up at the Admiral's face. And for the first time since entering the room, he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that men who have seen the very worst of humanity sometimes were when they encounter the very smallest of it. I appreciate the offer, Admiral, he said softly, but I believe I will stay. The smile unsettled Admiral Whitmore more than he wanted to admit. There was something behind it that he could not quite identify, something that made his instincts whisper warnings his ego refused to hear. He withdrew his hand from the old man's shoulder and took a half step back without consciously deciding to do so. But Marcus Whitmore had not risen to flag rank by backing down from challenges. He had built his entire identity around being the hardest man in any room, the one who never flinched, the one who broke others before they could break him. This shabby old vagrant was not going to be the exception. You want to stay? He said, recovering his composure. Fine. Then let us make this educational. He turned to address his young SEALs with the air of a professor about to deliver a particularly important lecture. Gentlemen, gather around. We are going to conduct a little practical examination. The operators formed a loose semicircle around Harlan and their admiral. There were perhaps 40 of them, ranging in age from mid-20s to late 30s, each one a graduate of the most demanding military training program on Earth. They looked at the old man in there, midst the way wolves might look at a rabbit that had wandered into their den. Whitmore began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. Tactical scenarios, he announced. Every operator worth his trident can break down a situation and explain the proper response. He stopped and pointed at Harlan. Let us see what our mysterious guest knows about real-world application. He described a scenario. A foreman team was inserted by helicopter into hostile territory. Their target was a high-value individual located in a fortified compound. During infiltration, one team member triggered an improvised explosive device and sustained critical injuries. The remaining 3 operators were now 2 kilometers from extraction with enemy forces converging on their position. What do you do? Whitmore demanded. Harlan was quiet for a moment, His eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of the ceremonial hall. When he spoke, his voice had changed subtly. It was still soft, still measured, but there was an authority in it that had not been there before. Your scenario is missing variables, he said. Time of day, terrain features, communication status with command, enemy force composition and armament, medical supplies available, whether the HVT has been secured or if the mission is still active. He paused. But if you want a classroom answer, you split the team. One man stays with the wounded operator to provide security and medical aid. The other two continue to the objective if mission parameters allow, or begin movement to extraction if they do not. You call for immediate close air support and medical evacuation. You adapt to conditions on the ground. The answer was textbook perfect, delivered with the ease of someone who had taught this material rather than learned it. Several of the younger operators exchanged glances. Whitmore's expression hardened. That is a by-the-book response. Any training manual would give you the same answer. He stepped closer to Harlan, his voice dropping. But real combat is not by the book. Real combat is chaos and blood and split-second decisions that get men killed. He jabbed a finger at the old man's chest. Have you ever actually been in that situation? Have you ever held a brother's guts in your hands while bullets snapped past your head? The room fell silent. The question was brutal, deliberately designed to expose a fraud who had only ever experienced combat through textbooks and documentaries. Harlan met the Admiral's gaze without blinking. 7 times, he said quietly. 7 times I have held a dying man and made the choice to continue or abort. 7 times I have had to decide who lives and who gets left behind. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was barely above a whisper. I remember every single one of their faces. I see them when I close my eyes at night. I will see them until the day I die. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Something in the way he said them, something in the absolute stillness of his delivery, made several of the older operators in the room shift uncomfortably. Near the back, Dwight Okonkwo had given up trying to push forward. He stood with the retired captain, both of them watching the confrontation with expressions of mounting dread. The captain had made a phone call of his own, speaking in urgent hushed tones before hanging up and shaking his head slowly. This is going to be bad, he muttered to Okonkwo. This is going to be very, very bad. Admiral Whitmore, however, remained unconvinced. Words, he declared loudly. Anyone can speak words. He turned to his SEALs with a dismissive wave. This is exactly what I warned you about, gentlemen. The world is full of men who have convinced themselves they are warriors. They read books. They watch documentaries. They memorize terminology and scenarios. And then they show up at events like this expecting to be treated as equals. He spun back to face Harlan, his patience finally exhausted. I want proof. I want a name I can verify. A unit. A commanding officer. Something concrete that proves you are anything more than a sad old man living in a fantasy world. Harlan considered the demand for a long moment. The ceremonial hall had gone completely quiet now. Even the ambient conversations had died away as more and more people turned their attention to the confrontation at the center of the room. Lieutenant Commander Reed had returned through the side door. His face was pale, and his hands were not quite steady as he approached Admiral Whitmore from behind. He touched the Admiral's elbow and leaned in to whisper something, but Whitmore shrugged him off irritably. Not now, Reed. He kept his eyes fixed on Harlan. I am waiting for an answer. Reed tried again, more urgently this time. Admiral, you need to hear this. I made a call to Warcom headquarters. I asked about this man. He swallowed hard. Sir, they would not tell me anything. They said the inquiry had been flagged and that I should expect a call back from someone with stars on their collar. Whitmore finally turned to look at his subordinate. His brow furrowed with confusion. What are you talking about? I am talking about the fact that a routine identity check on an elderly veteran just triggered some kind of security protocol I have never seen before. Reed glanced at Harlan, then back as Admiral. Sir, whoever this man is, he is not in any database I can access. It is like he does not exist. The Admiral stared at Reed for a long moment, processing this information. Then he laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the high ceiling. "That does not prove anything," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "It probably just means he was never actually in the service. No records because there is nothing to record." He turned back to Harlan with renewed aggression, determined to end this farce once and for all. "Last chance, old man. Give me something real, or I am having security escort you off this installation." Harlan stood in the center of that hostile circle, surrounded by elite warriors who had already judged and dismissed him. The afternoon light, slanting through the high windows, caught the silver of his hair and the deep lines carved into his face by decades of burdens no one in this room could imagine. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his windbreaker. Several of the younger SEALs tensed instinctively, their hands moving toward weapons that were not there. Harlan noticed the movement and paused, allowing them to see that his hand was empty except for a worn leather wallet. He opened the wallet and removed a single card, holding it out toward the Admiral. "This is all the identification I carry these days," he said. "It is not much to look at." Whitmore snatched the card and examined it with contempt. It was a Veterans Affairs identification card, unremarkable in every way. No rank listed, no unit designation, no declaración guseresastion, just a name, a photograph, and a service number. The Admiral held it up for the room to see. "This proves nothing," he announced triumphantly. "No rank, no unit, just a blank card that any bureaucrat could have issued." He tossed it back at Harlan with a flick of his wrist. "I think we're done here." The card fluttered to the floor between them. Harlan looked down at it, but made no move to pick it up. And then he asked a question that would change everything. "Admiral Whitmore," he said, his voice soft but carrying clearly through the silent room. "Have you ever heard of Operation Frozen Serpent?" The name landed in the room like a grenade with the pin pulled. Operation Frozen Serpent. Admiral Whitmore's expression flickered with something that might have been recognition before settling back into contemptuous dismissal. "Frozen Serpent," he repeated with a snort. "That old ghost story." He turned to address his young operators with the weary patience of a teacher debunking a popular myth. "Every few years, someone brings up Frozen Serpent. It is supposedly some legendary black operation from the Cold War. An impossible extraction behind enemy lines. A mission so classified that no records exist." He spread his hands wide and smiled. "The problem is that there is no evidence it ever happened. No confirmed participants. No declassified documents. Nothing but rumors and tall tales passed around by men who want to feel important." He looked back at Harlan with undisguised pity. "So if that is your proof, old-timer, you have just confirmed exactly what I suspected. You're living in a fantasy built from campfire stories." Several of the younger SEALs chuckled, but the sound was thinner than before. Something in the atmosphere had shifted when Harlan spoke those words. The older veterans in the room had gone rigid, their faces carefully blank in the way of men who have learned to hide their reactions under extreme circumstances. Dwight Okonkwo gripped the arm of the retired captain beside him so hard his knuckles went white. "He knows," Okonkwo whispered. "Dear God, he knows about Serpent because he was there. He was the one who planned it." The captain said nothing. His eyes were fixed on Harlan with an expression caught somewhere between reverence and terror. Harlan had not moved from his position at the center of the room. His VA card still lay on the floor between him and the Admiral, forgotten by everyone. When he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet authority that seemed so at odds with his humble appearance. "You are right that there are no official records," he said. "That was by design. 16 men went into a country that would have sparked an international incident if our presence had been discovered. The target was a Soviet nuclear physicist who wanted to defect. He had information about warhead deployments that would have changed the entire strategic calculus of the Cold War." Whitmore opened his mouth to interrupt, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the absolute certainty in the old man's voice. Perhaps it was the way the room had gone so completely silent that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. "We inserted by submarine," Harlan continued. "Swam 6 miles through water cold enough to kill an unprotected man in 20 minutes. Made contact with our asset and began extraction. And then everything went wrong. He paused, and his eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the walls of the ceremonial hall, something that existed only in memory and nightmare. The Soviets had been tipped off. We walked into an ambush designed to kill every one of us and recover their scientist. Harlan's voice dropped lower, forcing everyone to lean in to hear. We lost 9 men in the first 3 minutes. 9 operators who had families waiting at home. 9 brothers who trusted me to bring them back alive. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Admiral Whitmore seemed frozen, his prepared dismissals dying on his lips. "I made the call," Harlan said softly. "I ordered the survivors to continue the mission while I stayed behind to delay the pursuit." The math was simple. 7 men and the asset could make it to extraction if someone bought them time. I volunteer to be that someone. He finally looked up, meeting the Admiral's eyes with a gaze that carried decades of weight. "I spent 19 hours alone in hostile territory with Soviet special forces hunting me. 19 hours of running and fighting and doing things that still wake me up at 3 in the morning." He paused, but the extraction succeeded. The physicist made it out. And 4 months later, his intelligence helped us prevent what would have been a catastrophic miscalculation during a nuclear standoff that the public never knew about. Admiral Whitmore's face had lost some of its color. The story was too detailed, too specific, too laden with operational knowledge that no casual researcher could have fabricated. But his pride would not allow him to back down. "Anyone could make up a story like that," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Cold War operations. Soviet defectors. It is like something out of a spy novel." He forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Without verification, it is just words." Harlan nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly this response. "You are right to be skeptical, Admiral. A good officer should demand proof." He turned slightly, and for the first time seemed to notice Dwight Okonkwo standing near the back of the room. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and something passed between them that needed no words. Recognition. Remembrance. The bond shared by men who have walked through hell together. "Senior Chief Okonkwo," Harlan said, his voice carrying clearly. "It has been a long time." Every head in the room swiveled toward the retired senior chief. Okonkwo stepped forward on legs that seemed uncertain, his weathered face working through emotions he could not quite control. 37 years, he managed to say. 37 years since the Barents operation. His voice cracked slightly. "I was 23 years old, fresh out of the pipeline. You pulled me out of a firefight when I took shrapnel in both legs. Carried me 2 miles through frozen forest with a Soviet patrol 50 meters behind us." The room had gone utterly still. The young SEALs looked from Okonkwo to Harlan and back again, their expressions shifting from skepticism to uncertainty to something approaching awe. Admiral Whitmore stared at his former senior chief with dawning comprehension. Okonkwo had served under his command for 8 years. The man was a legend in his own right, a combat veteran whose service record was impeccable. If he was vouching for this old man, if he was claiming to have served under him, then everything Whitmore thought he knew about this situation was wrong. "Master Chief," Okonkwo said, and the title hung in the air like a thunderclap. He drew himself to attention despite his civilian clothes, rendering a salute that trembled with emotion. "It is an honor to see you again." Harlan returned the salute with the same precise economy of motion that had characterized everything he did. "The honor is mine, Dwight. You became one of the finest operators I ever trained." He turned back to Admiral Whitmore, and there was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction at the shifting tide, just that same quiet steadiness that had been there from the beginning. "I did not come here to prove anything, Admiral. I came because Commodore Hartwick invited me to a heritage ceremony honoring the men who built this community." He glanced down at his VA card, still lying on the floor. "I stopped wearing my rank and decorations a long time ago. The men who earned them alongside me are gone. Wearing them alone felt like betrayal." Whitmore stood paralyzed, his mind racing to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had believed just minutes ago. The young SEALs around him had fallen completely silent, their earlier mockery evaporating like morning mist. And then the main doors to the ceremonial hall burst open, and everything changed again. Three figures strode into the room with the purposeful urgency of men accustomed to commanding attention. At their center was a face that every person in that hall recognized instantly. Vice Admiral Jonathan Mercer, a three-star flag officer and one of the most senior leaders in Naval Special Warfare Command. Behind him walked two men in civilian suits whose bearing screamed intelligence community louder than any badge could have. The room snapped to attention automatically, decades of training overriding conscious thought. Admiral Whitmore straightened his spine and tried to compose his features into something appropriate for greeting a superior officer. But Vice Admiral Mercer did not even glance in his direction. He walked directly toward Harlan Creedy, his expression a mixture of respect and something that looked remarkably like humility. And the world that Admiral Marcus Whitmore thought he understood began to crumble around him. Vice Admiral Jonathan Mercer moved through the crowd of rigid operators like a ship cutting through still water. His 3 stars gleamed under the ceremonial hall's lights, and his face carried the weathered authority of a man who had spent 4 decades in service to his nation. Behind him, the 2 civilian suits maintained a respectful distance, their eyes scanning the room with the practiced alertness of men whose job titles would never appear on any organizational chart. The assembled SEALs parted before Mercer without being told. Junior officers pressed themselves against the walls. Even Admiral Whitmore seemed to shrink slightly as his superior passed within arm's reach without so much as a glance of acknowledgement. Mercer stopped directly in front of Harlan Creedy. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched across the room like a held breath, thick with anticipation and the dawning awareness that something extraordinary was unfolding. Then Mercer extended his hand, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the hall. "Master Chief Creedy," he said, "it is an honor. I was not expecting you to attend in person. When I heard you were here, I came as quickly as I could." Harlan took the offered hand and shook it once, firmly. "Admiral Mercer, it has been a while." The casualness of the exchange sent a ripple of confusion through the watching operators. A 3-star vice admiral had just crossed an installation to personally greet an old man in a windbreaker, addressing him by a rank that Whitmore had spent the last hour publicly denying. Mercer turned slightly, finally acknowledging the existence of the other people in the room. His gaze swept across the assembled faces before settling on Admiral Whitmore with an expression that was professionally neutral but somehow devastating in its restraint. "I understand there has been some confusion about Master Chief Creedy's credentials," Mercer said. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who never needed to raise it to be heard. "I am here to clear that up." He gestured to one of the civilians, who stepped forward carrying a slim leather portfolio. The man opened it and removed several documents, handing them to Mercer with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Most of what I am about to tell you remains classified at the highest levels," Mercer announced to the room. "What I can share has been recently approved for limited disclosure specifically for this heritage ceremony." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "What I cannot share would require clearances that fewer than 200 people in the entire country possess." Admiral Whitmore's face had gone the color of old chalk. His decorated chest seemed to deflate slightly as the magnitude of his error began to crystallize in his mind. Mercer glanced at the documents in his hand before continuing. "Master Chief Harlan Creedy, call sign Echo 9, served in Naval Special Warfare from 1966 to 1995. During that time, he participated in or commanded operations on 6 continents. His service record includes tours in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and 17 other countries whose names I am not authorized to speak in this setting." The room was absolutely silent. The young SEALs who had laughed at the old man's shabby appearance now stared at him with expressions frozen somewhere between shock and shame. "He is credited with personally training over 300 operators who went on to distinguished careers in this community," Mercer continued. "6 of those operators later received the Medal of Honor. 14 received the Navy Cross. The tactical doctrine currently taught at every level of SEAL training bears his fingerprints. The methodology for advanced reconnaissance that you gentlemen learned during your pipeline was developed from his after-action reports. Mercer paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like reverence. During the Cold War, Master Chief Creedy ran the most sensitive direct action missions in the history of naval special warfare. Operations that prevented 3 separate nuclear incidents. Extractions that brought home assets whose intelligence shaped American foreign policy for decades. He looked directly at Harlan, who stood motionless, his expression unchanged. He did all of this without recognition, without public acknowledgement, without any of the honors that lesser men chase their entire careers. One of the civilian suits stepped forward and spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, professional, carrying the particular blandness of someone trained never to reveal more than necessary. For the record, he said, Master Chief Creedy's identity was protected by presidential order for 28 years. That protection was only partially lifted 6 months ago when the Historical Review Board determined that enough time had passed for limited disclosure. He paused. Even now, there are operations in his file that will remain classified until everyone involved has been dead for 50 years. The words landed like hammer blows in the silent room. Admiral Whitmore stood frozen at attention, his mind struggling to process how catastrophically he had misjudged the situation. The old man he had mocked, the vagrant he had threatened to have escorted from the building, was not just a legitimate veteran. He was a living legend whose shadow loomed over everything the SEAL community held sacred. Lieutenant Commander Reed, who had made the phone call that started the cascade of revelations, watched his admiral with something approaching pity. He had served under Whitmore for 3 years and had always respected the man's operational record. But what he had witnessed today had forever altered his perception. Mercer tucked the documents back into the portfolio and handed it to the civilian. Then he turned to face Admiral Whitmore directly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Admiral Whitmore, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute command. I understand you have been entertaining our guest this afternoon. The words were polite. The implication was anything but. Whitmore opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in his decorated career, Marcus Whitmore had no idea what to say. Every excuse, every justification, every defense he might have offered crumbled to ash in the face of what had just been revealed. The young SEALs who had followed their admiral's lead in mocking the old man now refused to meet anyone's eyes. Several of them had gone pale, recognizing that they had participated in the public humiliation of a man whose service record dwarfed anything they could ever hope to achieve. In the center of it all, Harlan Creedy remained exactly as he had been since walking through the door. His posture was unchanged. His expression was unchanged. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus rather than a legend being revealed to a room full of warriors. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was what finally drove the truth home for everyone watching. Real heroes did not need to announce themselves. Real warriors did not demand recognition. The most dangerous men in the world often looked like nothing at all, because true excellence needed no advertisement. The silence that followed Vice Admiral Mercer's revelations was the kind that precedes earthquakes. It pressed against the walls of the ceremonial hall, heavy with the weight of shattered assumptions and dawning horror. Admiral Marcus Whitmore stood at rigid attention, his decorated chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, his mind cycling through the implications of what he had done. He had publicly mocked a man whose service record was classified by presidential order. He had accused a living legend of stolen valor. He had performed this humiliation in front of his subordinates, his peers, and now his superior officer. His career, which had seemed so unassailable just 30 minutes ago, now hung by a thread so thin he could feel it fraying with each passing second. Vice Admiral Mercer allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled operators. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, controlled, the voice of a man who understood that words delivered quietly often struck harder than those delivered in anger. "I want everyone in this room to understand something," he said. "What happened here today was not simply a case of mistaken identity. It was a failure of the most fundamental principle we are supposed to embody." He began to pace slowly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. "We are taught from the first day of training that the measure of a man is not found in his appearance, his rank, or his decorations. We are taught that the most dangerous operators often look the least impressive. We are taught that arrogance is a liability and humility is a strength." He stopped and turned to face the crowd directly. "And yet today, in this room, I witnessed a flag officer violate every single one of those principles. He publicly ridiculed an elderly veteran based entirely on his clothing and his refusal to boast about his accomplishments. He demanded proof of service from a man whose service should have been evident in his bearing, his composure, and his quiet dignity under attack." Admiral Whitmore flinched as if each word were a physical blow. The young SEALs around him seemed to shrink into themselves, recognizing that the rebuke applied to them as well. Mercer's gaze found Harlan, who had remained motionless throughout. There was a softness in the Vice Admiral's expression now, a respect that went beyond professional courtesy. "Master Chief Creedy could have ended this confrontation at any moment," Mercer said. "He could have produced credentials that would have silenced his critics instantly. He could have made phone calls that would have brought men far more powerful than anyone in this room running to his defense." He paused, but he did not do any of those things. Do you know why? The question hung in the air, unanswered. "Because real warriors do not need to prove themselves to those who cannot see," Mercer said quietly. "Because true strength is demonstrated through restraint, not retaliation. Because the men and women who have actually walked through fire do not waste their energy on those who have only ever watched from a distance." The words cut through the room like a blade. Several of the younger operators lowered their heads, unable to meet the Vice Admiral's eyes. Harlan finally moved, taking a single step forward. When he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet authority that had been present throughout, unchanged by either the humiliation or the vindication. "Admiral Mercer," he said, "I appreciate the kind words, but I did not come here to settle scores or embarrass anyone." Mercer turned to face him, genuine curiosity in his expression. Harlan continued, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the assembled operators. "I came because Commodore Hartwick invited me to honor the heritage of this community. The men who built what you have inherited were not perfect. They were flawed, stubborn, prideful. They made mistakes. They failed, and then they got back up and kept going." He paused, and something shifted in his bearing. For just a moment, the years seemed to fall away, and the men watching caught a glimpse of the warrior he had been. The operator who had survived 19 hours alone against Soviet special forces. The commander who had trained legends. The ghost whose call sign was whispered in classified briefings. "The young operators in this room made an error in judgment today," Harlan said. He looked directly at the SEALs who had laughed at him, and there was no anger in his gaze, only understanding. They followed the example set by their commanding officer. That is what young warriors do. They learn by watching. They model themselves on those who lead them. His attention shifted to Admiral Whitmore, who stood frozen under the weight of that steady gaze. "The question is not whether mistakes were made," Harlan continued. "Mistakes are inevitable. The question is what happens next. What a man does after he realizes he was wrong. That is the measure of his character." The words seemed to crack something in Whitmore's rigid facade. His jaw worked silently, his eyes bright with emotions he was struggling to contain. Dwight Okonkwo watched from his position near the back of the room, tears streaming openly down his weathered cheeks. He had served with Harlan Creedy in conditions that would have broken lesser men. He had seen this same grace under pressure before, this same refusal to let circumstances dictate his response. One of the civilian intelligence officers leaned over to his colleague and whispered something. The other man nodded, making a note in a small leather-bound book. Whatever they were recording, it was clear that this moment would find its way into reports that would be read at the highest levels. Vice Admiral Mercer studied Harlan for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He understood what the old warrior was doing. He was offering a path forward, a chance for redemption rather than destruction. Master Chief Creedy, Mercer said formally, the official reason for my presence here today was to participate in the heritage ceremony and to present you with a recognition that is long overdue. He gestured to one of his aides, who stepped forward carrying a polished wooden case. Given recent events, I think the timing is particularly appropriate. He accepted the case and held it before him, his expression solemn. By order of the Secretary of the Navy, with the concurrence of the Chief of Naval Operations and the approval of the President of the United States, I am authorized to present to you the following commendation. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Mercer opened the case, and even from a distance, the assembled operators could see the gleam of gold and the deep blue ribbon nestled against the velvet interior. For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in operations of vital importance to national security, conducted over a period of nearly 3 decades, and for demonstrating the highest traditions of naval special warfare through your courage, your leadership, and your unwavering commitment to your brothers in arms. He lifted his eyes to meet Harlan's gaze. The nation owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. But we can start by finally saying thank you. The medal resting in the velvet-lined case caught the light streaming through the high windows of the ceremonial hall. It was the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest non-combat decorations the Navy could bestow, reserved for exceptionally meritorious service in a duty of great responsibility. The gold medallion depicted an eagle standing upon an anchor, surrounded by a blue enamel circle bearing the words United States Navy. But it was not the medal itself that caused a ripple of whispered astonishment to pass through the assembled operators. It was what lay beneath it, nestled in a separate compartment of the case. A trident, the special warfare insignia that every SEAL earned upon completing the most grueling military training on Earth. The gold eagle clutching a trident, pistol, and anchor that marked a man as one of the elite. The symbol that Admiral Whitmore had publicly accused Harlan of never earning. This trident, Vice Admiral Mercer said, was recovered from the classified archives where Master Chief Creedy's service record has been secured for nearly 3 decades. He lifted it from the case with ceremonial reverence. It was never presented to him in a public ceremony because there could be no public acknowledgement of the missions that earned it. The men he served with knew. The commanders he reported to knew. But the rest of the world was never allowed to know. Mercer stepped closer to Harlan, the trident gleaming in his palm. We cannot undo the years of silence, he continued. We cannot give you back the recognition you were denied or the brothers you lost. But we can ensure that from this day forward, your service is honored as it should have been from the beginning. Harlan looked at the trident for a long moment. His weathered face remained composed, but something moved behind his pale blue eyes. A shadow of memory, a flicker of grief, the weight of decades spent carrying secrets that could never be shared. When he spoke, his voice was softer than it had been all afternoon. I stopped wearing the trident in 1995, he said, the day I buried the last of the men who served with me on Frozen Serpent. He paused, his gaze distant. We made a pact, the 7 of us who survived that extraction. We would carry each other's memories. We would never let the world forget what was sacrificed, even if we could never speak of it publicly. He looked up at Mercer, and there was a rawness in his expression that had not been visible before. I am the last one left, he said quietly. Tommy Hendricks died in 2003. Cancer. Marcus Webb passed in 2011. Complications from injuries he sustained on a mission in 1982. Joseph Kenna made it to 2018 before his heart gave out. He swallowed hard. Every year I visit their graves. I tell them the stories we shared. I make sure they are not forgotten. The room had gone absolutely still. The young SEALs who had laughed at this man just an hour ago now watched with expressions of profound shame and growing reverence. They were witnessing something rare, a glimpse into the soul of a warrior who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Vice Admiral Mercer's eyes glistened, though his bearing remained formal. He understood what Harlan was saying. The trident was not just a piece of metal. It was a covenant, a bond between brothers forged in blood and sacrifice. To wear it alone, without the men who had earned it alongside him, felt like betrayal. Master Chief, Mercer said gently, I understand why you put it away, but I would ask you to consider something. Harlan met his gaze without speaking. The men you trained, Mercer continued, the operators who learned from your example and went on to serve with distinction, they are part of your legacy too. The young men standing in this room right now, they carry forward what you built. They may not have known your name, but they have inherited your methods, your doctrine, your philosophy of what it means to be a SEAL. He held out the trident, offering it without pressure. Wearing this would not dishonor your brothers, he said. It would honor them. It would tell the world that their sacrifice produced something lasting, something that continues to protect this nation long after they are gone. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Every person in the room watched Harlan, waiting for his response. Dwight Okonkwo stepped forward from his position near the back. His voice was rough with emotion as he spoke. Master Chief, he said, I served under you for 3 months in 1987. You saved my life. You carried me through 2 miles of frozen hell when any sane man would have left me behind. He paused, fighting to keep his composure. I have spent the last 37 years trying to live up to your example, trying to be the kind of operator you showed me I could become. Other veterans in the room began to nod. Some of them had trained under Harlan without knowing who he was. Others had learned techniques passed down through generations of instructors, methods that traced their origins to this humble old man in the faded windbreaker. You did not just serve your brothers on those classified missions, Okonkwo continued. You served all of us. Every operator who came after you. Every young SEAL who learned to move through darkness because you wrote the playbook that taught them how. He drew himself to attention, his civilian clothes somehow looking like a uniform in that moment. We are your legacy, Master Chief. All of us. And we would be honored if you would wear the trident again. Not for yourself. For us. For the community you helped build. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The young SEALs who had mocked Harlan were now looking at him with something approaching awe. The older veterans stood straighter, their chins lifted, pride evident in their bearing. Admiral Whitmore remained frozen in place, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He was watching a man he had tried to destroy being elevated to something approaching sainthood, and every moment of it was a reminder of his own catastrophic failure. Harlan looked at Okonkwo for a long moment. Then his gaze traveled across the room, taking in the faces of men who represented everything he had worked for. Warriors who would carry forward the mission long after he was gone. Brothers in a community that transcended time and individual recognition. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out and took the trident from Vice Admiral Mercer's palm. He held it in his weathered fingers, feeling its weight, remembering all the years it had spent locked away in darkness, remembering the faces of the men who had earned it alongside him, remembering the promise they had made to each other in the frozen waters of the Barents Sea. For them, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. For all of them. And he pinned the trident to his faded windbreaker, directly over his heart. The moment the trident touched Harlan's chest, something shifted in the room. It was as if a circuit had been completed, a connection restored between past and present that had been severed for too long. The gold insignia gleamed against the faded navy fabric of his windbreaker, looking somehow more significant there than it would have on the most decorated dress uniform. One of the civilian intelligence officers stepped forward, a slim folder in his hands. He glanced at Vice Admiral Mercer, who nodded his permission. If I may, the officer said, addressing the room. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to dealing with information that could reshape perceptions. My name is not important. What matters is that I represent an office within the National Security Council responsible for historical review and selective declassification of intelligence operations. He opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. Master Chief Creedy's complete service record runs to over 400 pages, he continued. The vast majority of it remains classified and will likely stay that way for decades to come. However, certain statistical information has been approved for disclosure at this ceremony. The room leaned forward almost as one, hungry for details about the man they had so thoroughly misjudged. During his 29 years of active service, the officer read, Master Chief Creedy participated in or commanded 117 direct action missions across 6 continents. He was deployed to active combat zones for a cumulative total of 11 years, for months and 18 days. He sustained wounds in combat on 14 separate occasions, earning 2 Purple Hearts for injuries that could be publicly acknowledged. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. His decorations include the Navy Cross with 3 gold stars in lieu of additional awards, the Silver Star with 2 gold stars, the Bronze Star with Valor Device and 4 gold stars, and 7 additional commendations that remain classified along with the operations that earned them. A collective intake of breath swept through the assembled operators. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration that could be awarded to a member of the Navy, second only to the Medal of Honor. To receive it once was extraordinary. To receive it 4 times was almost unheard of. Admiral Whitmore's face had gone gray. The magnitude of what he had done, the depth of his misjudgment, seemed to grow with each revelation. He had accused this man of being a fraud, a fantasist, someone who had never seen combat. The reality was that Harlan Creedy had seen more combat than most warriors could experience in 10 lifetimes. The intelligence officer continued, his voice steady and professional. Beyond his personal operational record, Master Chief Creedy's impact on naval special warfare doctrine cannot be overstated. He authored or co-authored the training protocols for advanced maritime operations, close-quarters combat in denied environments, and long-range reconnaissance that are still in use today. His after-action reports from operations in Southeast Asia formed the foundation of what would eventually become the modern SEAL tactical playbook. He looked up from the paper, his gaze finding Harlan. 6 operators who trained directly under Master Chief Creedy went on to receive the Medal of Honor. 14 received the Navy Cross. The tactical innovations he developed during the Cold War have been credited with saving an estimated 700 American lives across subsequent conflicts. The numbers were staggering. The young SEALs in the room, men who had thought themselves the pinnacle of special operations capability, were confronting the reality that they stood on foundations laid by this quiet old man decades before they were born. Lieutenant Commander Reed found his voice. "Sir," he said, addressing the intelligence officer, "the security flag that was triggered when I made my inquiry. Can you explain what that was?" The officer exchanged a glance with his colleague before responding. "Master Chief Creedy's identity has been protected at the highest levels since 1972, he said. When he retired in 1995, that protection was extended indefinitely. Any inquiry into his background, any attempt to access his records, triggers an automatic alert that goes directly to the National Security Council." He allowed himself a small, tight smile. "Your phone call this afternoon set off alarms in offices that most people do not know exist." Reed swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how close he had come to stumbling into something far larger than he had imagined. The second intelligence officer spoke for the first time. His voice was softer than his colleagues, but carried an undertone of something that sounded almost like reverence. "There is one more thing that should be noted," he said. "In 1989, Master Chief Creedy was offered a commission as a full commander with a path to flag rank. He declined. In 1992, he was offered a position as a senior advisor to the National Security Council with a corner office in the West Wing. He declined that as well." He looked at Harlan with an expression of genuine respect. When asked why, his response was recorded in his file. He said that his place was with his brothers, that he would rather spend his remaining years training the next generation of operators than sitting behind a desk, making decisions about men whose boots he had not walked in. The room absorbed this information in silence. In a military culture where advancement and recognition were often pursued with relentless ambition, The idea of turning down a flag commission and a White House position was almost incomprehensible. Harlan stood at the center of this attention, his newly pinned trident catching the light with each subtle breath. His expression remained calm, though something in his eyes suggested that revisiting these chapters of his life was not without cost. "I did not join the Navy to collect ribbons," he said quietly. "I joined because I believed in something larger than myself. The missions we ran, the sacrifices we made, they were never about personal glory. They were about protecting people who would never know they were in danger." He looked at the young operators surrounding him, and his voice softened further. "Every one of you carries that same responsibility now. The country is counting on you, even if they do not know your names or your faces. That is the burden of this community. We serve in shadow so others can live in light." Vice Admiral Mercer nodded slowly, his respect for the old warrior evident in every line of his bearing. "Master Chief Creedy," he said formally, "on behalf of Naval Special Warfare Command, I extend our deepest gratitude for your service, your sacrifice, and your continued dedication to the principles that define this community." He turned to address the room at large. "Let this be a lesson that none of us forget. The measure of a warrior is not found in medals or titles or the volume of his voice. It is found in his actions, his integrity, and his willingness to put others before himself." His gaze settled briefly on Admiral Whitmore before moving on. "I expect every person in this room to reflect on what they witnessed today and to carry that reflection into their future service." The words hung in the air like a verdict, and everyone present understood that the reckoning was far from over. Vice Admiral Mercer turned to face Admiral Marcus Whitmore with the deliberate precision of a man about to deliver judgment. The ceremonial hall had gone so quiet that the soft hum of the air conditioning sounded like thunder. Every eye in a room fixed on the two flag officers, understanding that what happened next would determine the trajectory of a career and perhaps reshape the culture of the entire command. "Admiral Whitmore," Mercer said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I witnessed a flag officer publicly mock an attempt to humiliate a veteran whose service record exceeds that of anyone present in this room, including myself. I witnessed accusations of stolen valor, demands for proof of service, and threats of forcible removal from this installation." Whitmore stood at rigid attention, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. His decorated chest, which had seemed so impressive just an hour ago, now looked almost obscene in light of what had been revealed. Mercer continued, his tone never rising but somehow growing more devastating with each measured word. "These actions were conducted in front of junior officers and enlisted personnel, setting an example of leadership that violates every principle this community is supposed to embody. They were based entirely on superficial judgments of appearance and a refusal to consider that a man's worth might exceed what is visible on the surface." He paused, allowing the silence to amplify the impact of his words. "There will be a formal review of your conduct," he said. "The Inspector General's office will be notified. A written report will be submitted to the Chief of Naval Operations. Whatever the outcome of those proceedings, understand that what happened here today will follow you for the remainder of your career." Whitmore's face had gone the color of old parchment. His lips moved slightly, as if searching for words that might salvage something from the wreckage, but nothing emerged. From his position at the center of the room, Harlan Creedy watched the exchange with an expression that held neither satisfaction nor vindication. If anything, there was something resembling sadness in his pale blue eyes. "Admiral Mercer," he said quietly. Mercer turned, surprise flickering across his features. The room seemed to hold its breath as the old warrior stepped forward. "With respect, sir," Harlan continued, his voice calm and measured, "I would ask that you reconsider the formal review." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the assembled operators. After everything that had happened, after the public humiliation and the accusations and the threats, Harlan Creedy was intervening on behalf of the man who had tormented him. Mercer's brow furrowed. "Master Chief, I appreciate your grace, but there are standards that must be maintained. What Admiral Whitmore did today cannot be overlooked simply because the victim chooses to forgive. Harlan nodded slowly, acknowledging the point. I understand, sir, and I am not suggesting that his actions be overlooked. He turned to look at Whitmore, and something passed between them that the watching operators could not quite interpret. But I have learned over many years that there is a difference between accountability and destruction. He took another step toward the frozen Admiral, his movements unhurried, his bearing unchanged. Admiral Whitmore made a mistake, Harlan said. A serious one. He judged a book by its cover, and he did so loudly and publicly. He paused. But I have made mistakes too. Every operator in this room has made mistakes. The question is not whether we stumble. The question is what we do after we fall. The room listened in absolute silence. The young SEALs who had participated in mocking Harlan now watched with expressions caught between shame and hope. Harlan turned back to Vice Admiral Mercer. If Admiral Whitmore's career is destroyed over this incident, what lesson does that teach? He asked. That mistakes are unforgivable? That failure leads only to ruin? He shook his head slowly. The best warriors I ever knew were not the ones who never failed. They were the ones who failed, learned, and came back stronger. They were the ones who took their worst moments and transformed them into wisdom. Mercer studied the old warrior for a long moment, his expression unreadable. What would you suggest, Master Chief? Harlan considered the question carefully before responding. Let the Admiral's conscience be his punishment, he said. Let him carry the memory of this day and use it to become a better leader. He looked at Whitmore again. Embarrassment is a powerful teacher for a prideful man, sometimes more powerful than any formal reprimand. Whitmore's rigid posture seemed to crack slightly. His eyes, which had been fixed on some distant point, moved to meet Harlan's gaze. What he saw there was not the contempt he expected, not the satisfaction of a wronged man watching his tormentor fall. Instead, he saw something that looked remarkably like understanding. Master Chief, Whitmore managed, his voice hoarse and strained. I do not know what to say. I do not know how to apologize for what I did. Harlan regarded him steadily. You do not apologize to me, Admiral. I have survived far worse than harsh words from a man who did not know any better. He gestured toward the young SEALs watching from around the room. You apologize to them, Harlan continued. You apologize to the men you're supposed to lead, the men who watched you today and learned exactly the wrong lessons about what it means to be a warrior and an officer. Whitmore's gaze traveled across the faces of his subordinates. He saw the confusion in some, the disappointment in others, and the barely concealed contempt in a few. These were men who had trusted him, followed him, modeled themselves on his example. And today he had shown them something ugly about himself and about the culture he was supposed to embody. He drew a deep breath, his chest rising beneath all those ribbons that suddenly seemed so meaningless. You are right, he said, his voice cracking slightly. He turned to address the room, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked truly humbled. I owe every one of you an apology. What I did today was inexcusable. I judged a man by his appearance. I mocked someone who had every right to my respect. I set an example that contradicts everything we are supposed to stand for. He paused, struggling to maintain his composure. I was wrong, completely and utterly wrong. And I am sorry. The words hung in the air, raw and unvarnished. They were not the polished phrases of a politician managing a scandal. They were the broken acknowledgement of a man confronting his own failure. Lieutenant Commander Reed watched his admiral with something new in his expression. Not the hero worship of before, but perhaps the beginning of a different kind of respect. The respect reserved for those who can admit their mistakes publicly and accept the consequences. Harlan nodded slowly, a gesture of acceptance that carried more weight than any formal absolution. That is a start, Admiral, he said quietly. Now show them what you do next. The heritage ceremony that had been scheduled for that afternoon took on a different character than anyone had anticipated. Vice Admiral Mercer conferred briefly with Commodore Hartwick, who had arrived during the confrontation and stood near the back of the hall with an expression that suggested he had witnessed everything he needed to see. After a moment of quiet discussion, Mercer returned to address the assembled operators. Given the circumstances, he announced, "We will be adjusting today's program. The heritage ceremony will proceed, but with a different focus than originally planned." He gestured toward the side of the hall, where several staff members were wheeling in a display case that had been prepared for the event. Inside, arranged on black velvet, were items that told a story no words could fully capture. These artifacts were retrieved from the classified archives specifically for this ceremony, Mercer explained. They represent just a fraction of Master Chief Creedy's operational history, the pieces that could be displayed without compromising ongoing security concerns. The operators pressed closer, craning their necks to see. Inside the case lay a tactical blade with a worn leather handle, its edge still gleaming despite decades of age. Beside it rested a compass with a cracked crystal face, its housing dented and scarred. A set of dog tags hung from a simple chain, the names stamped into the metal deliberately obscured with black tape. And there, in the center of the display, was a photograph. It showed 7 young men in jungle fatigues, their faces painted with camouflage, their eyes carrying the particular intensity of operators about to insert into hostile territory. The jungle behind them was thick and menacing, the light filtering through the canopy, giving everything a greenish cast. 6 of the faces had been digitally blurred for security purposes, but one remained clear. A young Harlan Creedy, perhaps 30 years old, stood at the center of the group. His face was leaner than, unmarked by the decades that would follow, but his eyes held the same steady calm that the operators in the room had witnessed all afternoon. Even in that old photograph, even surrounded by men who were clearly warriors in their prime, there was something about him that commanded attention. The intelligence officer who had spoken earlier moved to stand beside the display. "This photograph was taken in 1971, he said. "The location remains classified. The mission remains classified. What I can tell you is that of the 7 men pictured here, only 4 returned. Master Chief Creedy carried one of the wounded for 16 miles through enemy territory to reach extraction." He pointed to the tactical blade. "This knife was a gift from the unit commander after that mission. It has been used in 17 subsequent operations. The notches you see on the handle do not represent what you might think. Each one marks an operator whose life Master Chief Creedy personally saved during his career." The room absorbed this information in heavy silence. The young SEALs studied the artifacts with new understanding, recognizing that each scratch, each dent, each mark of wear represented a story that would likely never be told. Dwight Okonkwo moved forward, his weathered face wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. He pointed to the compass. "I remember that compass," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He used it during the Barents operation. When our primary navigation equipment failed in the cold, that compass was all we had. He navigated us through 40 miles of frozen wilderness with nothing but that compass and the stars." Other veterans began to share their own memories. A retired commander spoke of a training evolution in 1988 where Harlan had demonstrated techniques that later saved his life in Panama. A former chief petty officer recalled a late-night conversation in a forward operating base where Harlan had talked him through the darkest moment of his career, giving him the strength to continue. One by one, the operators stepped forward. At first, it was only the older veterans, the men who had served during Harlan's active years and could speak from direct experience. But then the younger operators began to approach as well. A lieutenant who had learned a particular breaching technique during advanced training spoke of how that technique had saved his team during a raid in Afghanistan. A young petty officer described a survival protocol that had kept him alive during an equipment failure, a protocol he now learned had originated in one of Harlan's after-action reports from 40 years earlier. The threads of connection spread through the room like a web being revealed by morning light. Every operator present, whether they had known it or not, had been shaped by the man standing quietly before them. Vice Admiral Mercer watched these testimonials with visible emotion. When the last speaker had finished, he stepped forward to address the gathering once more. "What you have witnessed today," he said, "is the living embodiment of what heritage truly means. It is not plaques on walls or ceremonies once a year. It is the continuous chain of knowledge, sacrifice, and brotherhood that connects every operator to those who came before. He turned to face Harlan directly. Master Chief Creedy, for nearly 3 decades you served in silence. You trained generations of warriors who never knew your name. You wrote the doctrines that kept them alive. You made sacrifices that will never be publicly acknowledged. Mercer's voice grew thick with emotion. But today, at least within these walls, we acknowledge you. We see you, and we thank you. A spontaneous movement began near the front of the room. One of the young SEALs, a lieutenant junior grade who had been among those laughing at Harlan just 2 hours earlier, stepped forward and snapped to attention. He raised his hand in a crisp salute, holding it with rigid precision. Another operator joined him, then another. Within moments, every SEAL in the room was standing at attention, rendering honors to the old man in the faded windbreaker with a newly pinned trident over his heart. The veterans joined them, some in wheelchairs, some supported by canes, but all drawing themselves as straight as their aged bodies would allow. Dwight Okonkwo stood among them, his salute trembling with the force of 37 years of gratitude. Even Admiral Whitmore raised his hand, his decorated uniform somehow diminished next to the simple dignity of the man he was honoring. His salute was the sharpest he had ever rendered, a small act of penance for everything he had done wrong. Harlan Creedy stood alone at the center of that forest of salutes, his pale blue eyes moving slowly across the faces surrounding him. He saw young men at the beginning of their journeys, veterans near the end of theirs, and everything in between. He saw the community he had helped build, the legacy that would continue long after he was gone. And for the first time since walking through those doors, his composure cracked. A single tear traced down his weathered cheek as he raised his own hand and returned their salute. The salutes held for a long moment, a frozen tableau of respect that seemed to exist outside of time. Then Vice Admiral Mercer lowered his hand, and the room followed suit. But no one moved from their positions. No one spoke. The weight of what had just occurred pressed down on everyone present, reshaping their understanding of honor and legacy and the true meaning of service. Admiral Marcus Whitmore remained at attention even after the salute ended. His eyes were fixed on Harlan Creedy, and in them was something that had not been there before. Not the arrogance of a flag officer accustomed to deference. Not the defensive pride of a man protecting his reputation. What showed in Whitmore's eyes now was the raw vulnerability of someone who had been fundamentally changed. He stepped forward, moving through the crowd of operators who parted silently before him. Each step seemed to cost him something, as if he were walking toward a reckoning he had spent his entire career avoiding. When he reached Harlan, he stopped and stood facing the old warrior. The two men were a study in contrasts. Whitmore in his immaculate dress whites, chest heavy with ribbons, every inch the picture of military achievement. Harlan in his faded windbreaker, his only decoration the trident he had pinned there minutes ago, looking like someone's grandfather who had wandered in from a fishing trip. And yet there was no question which man commanded more respect in that room. Master Chief, Whitmore said, his voice stripped of all the bravado that had defined him earlier. I need to say something to you. Not as an admiral, not as a commanding officer, just as a man who did something unforgivable and needs to own it. Harlan regarded him with those pale blue eyes that had seen so much over the decades. He did not speak. He simply waited. Whitmore drew a breath that shuddered slightly despite his efforts to control it. I have spent my entire career building a reputation, he said, collecting medals, accumulating power, making sure everyone knew exactly how important I was. He paused, his jaw working. And today I realized that everything I thought mattered does not mean a damn thing. He gestured toward his decorated chest. These ribbons, these stars, they're supposed to represent service, sacrifice, leadership, but I wore them like armor. I used them to make myself feel superior to others, to justify treating people as less than me because they did not have what I had. His voice cracked slightly. You walked into this room with nothing. No rang visible, no declarations, no proof of anything. And I decided in an instant that you were worthless. that you deserved to be mocked and humiliated, that I had the right to tear you down in front of my men because you did not look the way I thought a warrior should look. The room listened in absolute silence. The young SEALs who had followed Whitmore's lead in ridiculing Harlan watched their admiral bare his soul, and something shifted in their understanding of what leadership actually meant. Whitmore continued, his words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. The truth is that I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid that if I did not constantly prove my dominance, people would see through me, would realize that underneath all the decorations, I was just a man terrified of being found inadequate. He shook his head slowly. And so I attacked you, because you represented everything I was afraid of becoming. Old, overlooked, forgotten. He looked directly into Harlan's eyes. But you're not any of those things, he said. You are more of a warrior than I will ever be. More of a leader. More of a man. And I am ashamed of what I did to you today. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. The entire room seemed to lean forward, waiting for his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. Admiral Whitmore, he said, do you know what separates the operators who thrive in this community from the ones who burn out? Whitmore shook his head. It is not skill, Harlan continued. It is not courage. It is not even discipline, though all of those matter. He paused. It is the ability to look at yourself honestly, to see your own flaws without flinching, to admit when you are wrong and then do the hard work of becoming better. He reached out and placed a weathered hand on Whitmore's shoulder. What you just did took more courage than most men possess, Harlan said quietly. You stood in front of your subordinates and admitted your failures. You stripped away your armor and let them see the real man underneath. He squeezed the Admiral's shoulder gently. That is leadership. That is what these young operators needed to see from you. Whitmore's composure finally broke. His shoulders shook as tears streamed down his face, cutting channels through the rigid mask he had worn for so long. He wept openly in front of his men, in front of his superiors, in front of everyone. And somehow, in that moment of complete vulnerability, he became more human than he had ever allowed himself to be. The young SEALs watched their admiral cry, and instead of losing respect for him, they found something new growing in its place. They had seen him at his worst today. They had watched him fail catastrophically, and now they were watching him take accountability without excuses, without deflection, without any of the political maneuvering that so often accompanied military scandals. Lieutenant Commander Reed felt his own eyes burn with unexpected emotion. He had served under Whitmore for 3 years and had never seen the man show anything resembling vulnerability. This broken figure before him was simultaneously the weakest and strongest version of his commanding officer he had ever witnessed. Harlan stood patiently as Whitmore composed himself, never removing his hand from the Admiral's shoulder. When the worst of the emotion had passed, he spoke again. The measure of a man is not how he performs when everything goes right, he said. It is how he responds when everything goes wrong. Today you failed. He paused. Tomorrow you have the chance to begin again. What you do with that chance will define the rest of your career. Whitmore wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture that would have seemed undignified an hour ago, but now seemed simply human. How do I begin? He asked, his voice hoarse. How do I become the leader these men deserve? Harlan's weathered face softened with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. You start by listening, he said. You watch more than you speak. You learn the names of every person under your command, and remember that each one of them has a story you know nothing about. He paused. And you never, ever assume that you know everything about someone based on what you see on the surface. Whitmore nodded slowly, absorbing the words like a drowning man absorbing oxygen. I will try, he said. I will spend whatever time I have left in this uniform trying to become worthy of it. Harlan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. That is all any of us can do, he said quietly. Try. Fail. Try again. The important thing is that we never stop trying. He removed his hand from Whitmore's shoulder and stepped back. Now, Admiral, he said, there is a heritage ceremony that needs completing, and I believe you have a room full of operators who could use a leader worth following. The heritage ceremony concluded as the afternoon light began to fade beyond the high windows of the hall. Vice Admiral Mercer presented Harlan with a commemorative shadow box containing a folded American flag, a bronze replica of the Seal Trident, and a plaque that read simply "For service beyond measure." The words were inadequate, everyone knew, but some debts could never be fully expressed in language. One by one, the active duty SEALs approached Harlan to pay their respects. They did not speak for the most part. There were no words sufficient to bridge the gap between what they had assumed about this man and what he had turned out to be. Instead, they simply stood before him, rendered a salute, and moved on. Each gesture was an apology. Each salute was a promise to do better. The young lieutenant, junior grade, who had been among the first to laugh at Harlan's appearance, was among the last to approach. His name was Christopher Tanaka, and he had graduated from BUD/S just 18 months earlier with the highest marks in his class. He had arrived at the ceremony that afternoon full of confidence in his own excellence, certain that he had already proven himself worthy of the trident on his chest. Now he stood before Harlan with the humility of a man who had learned how much he did not know. "Master Chief," Tanaka said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I am sorry. For laughing. For assuming. For everything." Harlan studied the young operator's face for a long moment. Then he reached out and tapped a finger against the trident pin to Tanaka's uniform. "This means you survived the hardest military training on Earth," he said quietly. "But earning it was just the beginning. What you do from this day forward is what will define whether you deserve to keep wearing it." Tanaka nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "You made a mistake today," Harlan continued. "You followed the crowd instead of trusting your own judgment. You let someone else's prejudice become your own." He paused. "Learn from it. Remember how it felt to be wrong about something so fundamental. And the next time you are tempted to judge someone by their appearance, remember this moment." Tanaka managed a hoarse response. "I will, Master Chief. I swear I will." Harlan nodded once, a gesture of acceptance and dismissal. The young lieutenant moved away, his expression carrying the weight of a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his career. As the crowd began to thin, Admiral Whitmore approached one final time. He had composed himself, though the evidence of his earlier breakdown still showed in the redness around his eyes. He carried himself differently now, the swagger replaced by something more measured, more considered. "Master Chief," he said, "I wanted to thank you for what you said, for the chance you gave me." Harlan regarded him steadily. "Do not thank me yet, Admiral. Words are easy. It is what comes after that matters." Whitmore nodded. "I understand, and I meant what I said. Whatever time I've left in this uniform, I will spend it trying to become worthy of it." He hesitated, then added, "I would like to stay in touch, if you would permit it. I have a feeling there is much I could learn from you." Something shifted in Harlan's expression, a softening that might have been approval. "I'm not hard to find," he said. "I live in a small house about 20 miles from here. I sit on my porch most mornings and watch the sun come up." He paused. "You're welcome to join me sometime. The coffee is terrible, but the conversation might be worthwhile." It was an olive branch, extended without ceremony. Whitmore accepted it with a nod that carried more gratitude than any words could express. Vice Admiral Mercer and the intelligence officers prepared to depart. Before leaving, Mercer clasped Harlan's hand one final time. "The community owes you more than we can ever repay," he said. "If there is anything you need, anything at all, you have only to ask." Harlan shook his head slowly. "I have everything I need, Admiral. A roof over my head, my memories. And now," he glanced at the trident on his chest, "it is more than enough." Mercer nodded, understanding in his eyes. He rendered one final salute, then turned and walked out of the hall with his entourage following behind. The room emptied gradually until only a handful of people remained. Dwight Okonkwo was among them, unwilling to let his former commander leave without a proper farewell. The two men stood together near the display case that held the artifacts of Harlan's service, their silence comfortable in the way of old friends who have said everything that needed saying long ago. "It was good to see you, Dwight," Harlan said finally. "You turned out well. I always knew you would." Okonkwo's eyes glistened. "Everything I am, Master Chief, I owe to you. You gave me a second chance when most men would have left me behind. Harlan shook his head. I just carried you for a few miles. You did the rest yourself. They embraced briefly, the kind of hug that warriors share when words fail. Then Okonkwo stepped back and saluted one last time before walking away, his shoulders straighter than they had been in years. Harlan Creedy stood alone in the nearly empty hall, the late afternoon light painting long shadows across the polished floor. He looked at the display case with its artifacts and photographs, the physical evidence of a lifetime spent in service to something larger than himself. His hand moved to touch the trident pinned over his heart, feeling its familiar weight against his chest. He thought of Tommy Hendricks and Marcus Webb and Joseph Cantu, the brothers who had walked this path with him and now waited somewhere beyond. He thought of the young operators who would carry the mission forward, inheriting traditions they barely understood from men whose names they might never know. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Harlan walked slowly toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. At the door, he paused and looked back one final time at the hall, where so much had changed in the span of a single afternoon. Then he stepped out into the fading light, a quiet legend returning to the anonymity he had always preferred. If this story moved you today, if it reminded you that true heroes often walk among us unrecognized, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this one. And we would love to know, have you ever witnessed someone who is underestimated reveal their true worth? Have you ever met a quiet legend in your own life whose humble appearance concealed an extraordinary story? Share your experience in the comments below, because every community has its hidden heroes, and sometimes all they need is for someone to see them clearly.